On a still autumn afternoon in 1906, the light over 525 South Winchester Boulevard in San Jose falls low and slanting, catching in the colored facets of a single spiderweb stained glass window that Sarah Winchester designed herself. Dust hangs in the air of La Nada Villa, disturbed by the aftershocks that have cracked chimneys and twisted gables since the great earthquake in April. In the ruined upper stories, a 7-story tower has folded into itself. Downstairs, the carved teak and mahogany of the ballroom walls remain perfectly intact, their intricate patterns a quiet defiance against the fractured brick above. On a table nearby lies a folded clipping from the San Francisco Chronicle, that piece from February 1895, which insisted, "The sound of the hammer is never hushed. The reason is, in Mrs. Winchester's belief, that when the house is entirely finished, she will die." Outside, scaffolds tilt, workmen stand idle, and the staircase that once rose toward the missing tower now stops at open sky. For a moment, the mansion looks less like a fortress against ghosts than a fragile monument to one woman's unfinished grief, and to a legend that will outlive her. In the early spring of 1881, in New Haven, Connecticut, the house on Prospect Hill, where Sarah Lockwood Pardee Winchester had once planned a conventional life, fell quiet. Within a single year, she had lost her mother-in-law, Jane Winchester, her powerful father-in-law, Oliver Winchester, and finally her husband, William Wirt Winchester, heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The deaths arrived in succession like chapters closing. Jane in June of 1880, Oliver in December of that same year, and William in March of 1881, dead at age 43 from pulmonary tuberculosis that had wasted him slowly over the preceding months. Each funeral was conducted at Center Church on the New Haven Green, where the Winchester family pew stood in the 4th row, its dark wood polished by generations of Sunday attendance. Probate records filed in the New Haven County Courthouse show that William's death left Sarah an estate valued at roughly $20 million in stocks and securities, along with nearly 50% of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company's outstanding shares. The company's ledgers, preserved today in the Connecticut State Library, show that these holdings provided her with a daily dividend income of approximately $1,000 in 1880s currency, a sum that translates to somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000 per day in modern purchasing power. The accountants who prepared the estate inventory noted the figures in careful copperplate script, their precision a stark contrast to the grief that had occasioned the calculation. The same probate documents that recorded Sarah's sudden wealth also noted, in a brief marginal entry, the earlier loss of her infant daughter Annie in 1866. The child had died at 6 weeks of age from marasmus, a wasting disease whose causes 19th century medicine could neither explain nor prevent. The baby's death certificate, filed at the New Haven Department of Health, listed the cause with clinical brevity. The family's private grief remained unrecorded in any public document. What survives instead are the silences in Sarah's later correspondence, the absence of children in a marriage that had lasted 14 years, and the weight of loss that some later interpreters would read into every architectural decision she made. By 1885, Sarah's physicians in New Haven were recommending that she relocate to a drier climate to ease the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis that had begun to stiffen her joints and curtail her mobility. Letters from her doctor, preserved among family papers, suggested California or the Southwest, regions where the warm, arid air might provide relief from the damp New England winters that aggravated her condition. Sarah was 46 years old, a widow of independent means and diminishing family ties in Connecticut. That autumn, she began making inquiries about property in the Santa Clara Valley of California, a region then known primarily for its orchards and its proximity to the growing city of San Francisco. In February of 1886, she purchased an 8-room farmhouse on a 45-acre ranch just outside San Jose, California. The deed of sale, recorded at the Santa Clara County Recorder's Office on February 22, 1886, listed the purchase price as $12,570. The property was described as one two-story frame dwelling house containing 8 rooms with outbuildings situated on approximately 45 acres of improved ranch land, including bearing fruit trees, principally apricot and plum. The seller was Dr. Robert Caldwell, a local physician who had used the property as a rural retreat. Sarah signed the deed in her careful, controlled hand, the signature firm despite the arthritis that would later bend her fingers. The ranch sat on a gentle rise in the valley floor, surrounded by orchards that stretched in neat rows toward the foothills of the Santa Cruz Mountains. In winter, fog from the bay settled in the low places, and in summer, the heat was dry and constant. The house itself was modest by the standards of New Haven society, a simple Italianate farmhouse with wide eaves and tall windows that looked out over the fruit trees. There was no suggestion, in that first winter, that the property would become anything other than a comfortable retirement home for a wealthy widow seeking relief from the New England cold. Sarah renamed the property Lanada Villa, the house on the plain, a name that reflected both the valley's flat expanse and her Welsh heritage through her mother's Pardee lineage. She moved in during the spring of 1886, bringing with her a small staff of servants from New Haven and furnishings that included some pieces from her married home. Neighbors in San Jose noted her arrival with the and a mild curiosity accorded to any newcomer of evident means, but there was little to distinguish her from other wealthy Easterners who had come west for health or opportunity. The San Jose Mercury Herald mentioned her purchase in a brief real estate notice, describing her only as Mrs. S. L. Winchester of New Haven, widow of the late William Winchester. Light in these early years falls through simple sash windows onto plain floorboards, no spiderweb glass yet, no staircases climbing toward nothing, only the steady tick of a clock in the parlor and the distant clatter of Southern Pacific trains running north toward San Francisco. The architectural ambition that will later consume the estate is still latent, contained within the wealth that made it possible and the private motivations that will never be fully documented. The house at this stage is merely a house, 8 rooms, wooden floors, a roof that keeps out the rain. The woman who would one day be accused of building a maze for ghosts begins, on paper, with nothing more exotic than a small farmhouse and a very large income. By the spring of 1887, barely a year after Sarah Winchester's arrival in San Jose, Carpenter's daybooks kept by contractors in Santa Clara County begin to show a recurring entry. Days worked at Mrs. Winchester's place, with notations of hours, materials requisitioned, and wages paid. Several of these ledgers, preserved in the San Jose Historical Museum, indicate wage rates that were higher than the local standard. Some accounts suggest up to 50% more than what other estate owners were paying for comparable work. One carpenter, whose name appears in an 1889 timesheet, earned $3 for a 10-hour day at Lanada Villa, while the prevailing rate for ranch construction in the valley was closer to $2. The original 2-story, 8-room farmhouse quickly became a scaffolded silhouette. Sarah initially hired a San Jose architect named H. Myers to draw up plans for an addition, a single ballroom wing that would extend the house to the south. But within months, neighbors reported seeing Mrs. Winchester herself walking the construction site with folded papers in her hands, pointing and directing as carpenters adjusted framing and altered window placements. By late 1887, Myers was no longer associated with the project, and no other architect's name appears in the building permits filed with the city of San Jose over the next 30 years. Contemporary accounts from the San Jose Daily Mercury and later interviews conducted by local historians agree on this point. Sarah dismissed professional architects early and began sketching her own floor plans. She adapted patterns from architectural plan books, popular publications such as Palliser's Model Homes and Scientific American Architects and Builders edition, and from memories of grand estates she had visited with William during their years in New Haven and their travels to Europe in the 1870s. Photographs from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, found later among her papers, show pages marked and corners turned down at images of ornate pavilions and Queen Anne-style decorative details. By 1890, the modest farmhouse had swelled into a rambling mansion that county tax assessors were beginning to describe as extensive and of unusual design. The structure now rose 3 stories in some sections, with a central tower that climbed higher still. The exterior was clad in redwood shingles cut into decorative patterns, scalloped, diamond-shaped, and fish-scale designs that layered across the gables in the elaborate style favored during the Queen Anne revival. The roofline bristled with cupolas, belvederes, and finials. Wraparound verandas circled the first floor, their posts and brackets carved with floral motifs and geometric patterns. Inside, the house was becoming a catalog of Gilded Age decorative ambition. Surviving inventories from the later auction of Sarah's estate, held in 1923, list wall treatments that included lincrusta, embossed wall covering made from a mixture of linseed oil and wood pulp, designed to simulate tooled leather, pressed tin, and carved wood. Rooms were trimmed in imported hardwoods, teak from Burma, mahogany from Honduras, maple and oak from American forests. Ceilings were stenciled in gold and silver leaf, following patterns derived from the aesthetic movement that had dominated fashionable interiors in the 1880s. Chandeliers imported from Europe, Bohemian crystal, French gilt bronze, hung from ceiling medallions plastered in intricate relief. Somewhere in this period, Sarah began commissioning stained glass windows from the Pacific American Decorative Company, a San Francisco firm whose correspondence with her was later found sealed behind a wall panel during renovation work in the 1970s. The letters, now held in the Winchester Mystery House archives, discuss designs, costs, and delivery schedules. One letter, dated November 1891, acknowledges receipt of a sketch for a window in the spiderweb pattern, with colored jewels as specified. This is the first documentary reference to the spiderweb motif that would later become one of the house's most famous features. The house at this stage is not yet a mystery, but a kind of private architectural laboratory, financed by rifle dividends and a widow's determination to control at least one realm of her life. City building inspectors, making their required visits, noted in their reports that the construction was of high quality. Framing solid, foundations well laid, materials first-rate, but that the layout was irregular and difficult to navigate. One inspector, writing in 1892, remarked that he had become lost trying to find his way back to the front entrance after inspecting an upstairs bedroom, and had to be guided out by a servant. Neighbors in the surrounding ranches watched the house grow with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. The mansion was undeniably grand, a statement of wealth and taste in a valley still dominated by farmhouses and orchards. But the scale of the construction, the constant presence of workers, and the owner's reclusiveness gave rise to questions. Mrs. Winchester was rarely seen in San Jose society. She did not attend the functions at the San Jose Women's Club or the exhibitions at the San Jose Museum Association. Her servants did the marketing in town, and when she traveled to San Francisco or later to a second home in Atherton, she did so quietly, without announcement. What begins to puzzle the neighbors is not yet the house's supposed ghosts or curses. It is the scale of her freedom. Here is a woman, widowed and childless, deploying a fortune with complete autonomy, answering to no husband, father, or son. She hires and dismisses workers, alters designs, commissions custom glass and imported wood, all without seeking approval or justification. In an age when women's property rights were still contested in many states, and when a widow's wealth was often managed by male relatives or trustees, Sarah Winchester's financial independence is itself remarkable. The house, growing room by room and tower by tower, is the visible expression of that independence, a kind of argument in wood and glass against the limitations imposed on women of her generation. As the walls climb and the rooms multiply, what begins to puzzle the neighbors is not yet the house's ghosts. It is the scale of her freedom. By the winter of 1895, La Nada Villa was large enough that it could no longer hide behind its citrus groves. The mansion's silhouette, with its towers and turrets and layered gables, is visible from Winchester Boulevard, the road that will later be named, with unintended irony, for the woman whose house defines it. The property now sprawls across several acres of what had been orchard land, the original farmhouse long since absorbed into a structure that county records are beginning to describe as a mansion of considerable size and unusual configuration. On February 24, 1895, the San Francisco Chronicle published an article that will shape the estate's reputation for the next century and beyond. The piece, written by an unnamed reporter who claims to have visited the property, describes a house under perpetual construction. The sound of the hammer is never hushed, the article states, day or night, weekdays and Sundays, at Mrs. Winchester's Santa Clara County home. The reason for it is in Mrs. Winchester's belief that when the house is entirely finished, she will die. The article goes on to describe a widow obsessed with construction, driven by a superstitious fear that ceasing work will bring about her death. It mentions servants who whisper of strange nightly rituals in rooms that are built only to be torn down and rebuilt. A month later, on March 29, 1895, the San Jose Daily News picked up the theme with a piece titled, "Strange Story, A Woman Who Thinks She'll Die When Her House is Built." This article adds details that will become central to the legend. It describes a handsome residence apparently ready for occupancy, yet subject to endless additions and alterations, and it repeats the claim that Mrs. Winchester is building to appease spirits or to forestall her own death. The reporter notes that the house is never finished because Mrs. Winchester believes that as long as building continues, she will live. These two articles, preserved today in the California Room of the San Jose Public Library and in the microfilm archives of the Chronicle, are the first clear documentary evidence of the superstition that will later be elaborated into tales of curses, vengeful spirits, and a Boston medium who supposedly told Sarah she must build to atone for the deaths caused by Winchester rifles. At the time, the articles served multiple purposes. They satisfy the Gilded Age appetite for stories of eccentric wealth, particularly when that wealth is held by a woman operating outside conventional social structures. They also reflect a growing public unease about the sources of industrial fortunes, an unease that will intensify in the progressive era as labor movements and muckraking journalists expose the human costs of America's rapid industrialization. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company, by 1895, is one of the most successful firearms manufacturers in the world. Its rifles, particularly the Model 1873, known as the gun that won the West, have been used in the American Civil War, in the Indian Wars, in conflicts across Latin America and Asia, and in countless acts of individual violence. The company's advertising, preserved in periodicals of the era, celebrates the rifle's reliability and stopping power. But that same advertising, rid with the knowledge of what those rifles have done, becomes a ledger of mortality. Some estimates, compiled later by historians of the American West, suggest that Winchester rifles were responsible for tens of thousands of deaths in the decades following the Civil War. Deaths of soldiers, Native Americans, settlers, outlaws, and bystanders caught in the violence of a rapidly expanding nation. Sarah Winchester, the widow who now owns nearly half the company, says nothing publicly about these deaths. No surviving letter, diary entry, or recorded statement suggests that she felt personal guilt or responsibility for the uses to which her family's rifles were put. What does survive is her house, a structure that some will interpret as an attempt at atonement, a fortress against vengeful spirits, or a monument to grief so profound that it required architectural expression. The truth, as is often the case, is likely more complicated and less dramatic. But in the absence of her own testimony, the house itself is forced to speak for her. The 1895 newspaper articles introduce a narrative template that will be repeated and embellished for the next 100 years. Wealthy widow, driven by guilt or fear or madness, builds ceaselessly to appease the ghosts of those killed by her family's weapons. The story is compelling because it combines elements that fascinate the American public: wealth, death, women's psychology, and the moral ambiguity of industrial capitalism. It also allows readers to feel a certain satisfaction in the idea that great wealth brings not happiness but torment, that the rich are haunted by their riches. What the articles do not mention, because it does not fit the narrative, is that Sarah Winchester is also, during this period, a woman of evident practicality and business acumen. She manages her investments carefully, maintains correspondence with her attorneys and financial advisors, and handles the logistical complexities of running a large household and construction project with apparent efficiency. Neighbors who know her, in the few later interviews that survive, describe her as reserved but intelligent, eccentric in her building habits but not deranged. One San Jose resident, interviewed by historian Mary Jo Ignafo in the 1990s, recalled that his grandmother had known Mrs. Winchester and had always spoken of her as a very sharp woman who knew exactly what she was doing. But by 1895, the public story was set. The house at 525 South Winchester Boulevard is no longer just an unusual mansion. It is a haunted house, a monument to guilt, a mystery wrapped in redwood shingles and stained glass. The local press and soon the regional and national press will return to this story again and again, each retelling adding new details and elaborations. Within a decade, the legend will include seances, a Boston medium, nightly consultations with spirits, and architectural features specifically designed to confuse or trap ghosts. Most of these details have no documentary support, but they have something more powerful: narrative inevitability. The same industrial prosperity that funded opera houses, universities, and public libraries also produced new forms of public scrutiny. Architecture became a visible ledger of moral questions. Every mansion on Fifth Avenue, every estate in Newport, every grand house rising from the fortunes of railroads, steel, oil, or firearms became a target for interpretation. What did it mean that such wealth existed alongside such poverty? What did it say about a society that allowed, even celebrated, such disparities? And what did it reveal about the individuals who built these monuments to their own success? From this moment on, every new staircase and tower at Lanata Villa will be interpreted not just as construction, but as evidence. In the years between 1896 and 1900, the house's silhouette changed almost monthly. San Jose city directories from this period, archived at the California Room, show the property's assessed value climbing steadily, from $18,000 in 1896 to $32,000 in 1898 to $55,000 by 1900. Insurance. Maps prepared by the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company, which meticulously documented building footprints for underwriting purposes, show Lanata Villa expanding in irregular bursts. A tower appears on the 1897 map that is absent from the 1896 survey. By 1899, that same tower had been removed and a new wing added to the east. A report in the San Jose News from October 1897 claims that a 7-story tower on the estate has been torn down and rebuilt some 16 times, each reconstruction differing from the last. The article offers no source for this specific number, and later historians have been unable to verify it from building permits or contractor records. But the detail is repeated often enough in subsequent newspaper stories, in early tourist brochures, in the oral histories collected decades later, that it becomes part of the established narrative, whether or not the number is exactly accurate. What seems clear is that Sarah Winchester did order significant alterations to the house's upper stories during this period, and that these changes involved both demolition and reconstruction on a scale unusual for residential architecture. Later accounts, particularly those produced after the house opened to the public in 1923, insist that carpenters at Lanata Villa worked in shifts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 38 years, from 1886 until Sarah's death in 1922. This claim appears in magazine articles from the 1920s and 1930s, in early guidebooks sold at the mansion, and in the oral tradition that developed around the property. It suggests a kind of frenzy, an obsessive compulsion that drove Sarah to keep hammer swinging and saws cutting without pause. But interviews conducted in the 1980s and 1990s by researcher Bruce Spoon and historian Mary Jo Ignafo paint a more complicated picture. Spoon spoke with descendants of workers who had been employed at the house, and Ignafo reviewed financial records and correspondence that suggested a different rhythm. What emerges from these accounts is a pattern of steady but not continuous work, carpenters hired for weeks or months at a time, then dismissed or laid off while Sarah reconsidered her plans, periods of intense activity followed by lulls of several months. Projects started, abandoned, and later resumed. One elderly San Jose resident, interviewed by Ignafo, recalled his grandfather saying that Mrs. Winchester would sometimes call the crew back after a break of half a year, having decided on a new design for a room that had been framed but never finished. The city tax rolls from Santa Clara County, available on microfilm at the San Jose State University Library, show property tax payments that remain substantial but consistent, suggesting steady rather than explosive spending. Building material invoices preserved among Sarah's estate papers indicate large but not reckless expenditure, orders for lumber, hardware, glass, and decorative elements that reflect high-quality construction, but not the kind of unchecked spending that the building without cease legend implies. What seems true is this: Sarah Winchester built extensively, with frequent changes and alterations over a period of many years. She employed skilled craftsmen and paid them well. She maintained high standards for materials and workmanship, and she reserved the right to change her mind, to tear down what had just been built if it did not satisfy her, to experiment with designs, to add rooms and features that served no obvious practical purpose. This behavior, while unusual, is perhaps better understood as the prerogative of wealth and autonomy than as evidence of madness or supernatural compulsion. Architecturally, this is the period when the house's most famous oddities begin to appear. The switchback staircase, which eventually climbs 44 steps to ascend only 9 or 10 feet in vertical height, is likely built during these years, though the exact date is uncertain. Photographs from the 1900s show it in place, its shallow treads, each riser only about 2 inches high, polished smooth by use. Later interpretations will claim the staircase was designed to confuse spirits, but a more prosaic explanation lies in Sarah's arthritis. For a woman of small stature, whose joints had stiffened with age and disease, shallow steps would have been far easier to navigate than a conventional staircase. The switchback design, which requires multiple turns and landings, also provides frequent resting points. Similarly, doors and windows that open into walls, features that tour guides will later describe as ghost traps or architectural jokes, are more likely the result of successive building phases that overtook earlier exterior facades. A window that once looked out onto a garden is now an interior window because a new wing was added beyond it. A door that once opened onto a veranda now opens onto a wall because that veranda was enclosed and converted into a hallway. In a house built over decades without a master plan, such oddities are almost inevitable. Other features of the house from this period reveal a genuine interest in innovative design and mechanical systems. Sarah installed an early elevator in the house, a hydraulic lift powered by a basement pump, sometime around 1900, making La Nada Villa one of the first private residences in California to have such a device. She also designed an elaborate drainage system for the conservatory, with trapdoors in the floor that allowed excess water to flow into pipes leading to the gardens below. The ballroom, completed around 1898, featured built-in wall cabinets with curved glass doors that could display decorative objects while protecting them from dust. Neighbors' accounts from this period, preserved in oral histories and in the columns of the San Jose Mercury, describe Sarah as clear-headed and fiscally shrewd, not the helpless captive of a curse. One story, repeated in several sources, describes her negotiating the price of lumber with a supplier, insisting on a discount for a bulk order, and getting it. Another account describes her personally inspecting the work of a plasterer and pointing out flaws that needed correction before she would approve payment. These are not the actions of a woman in the grip of irrational fear. They are the actions of a careful, demanding employer who expects value for money spent. The myth of round-the-clock construction and the reality of a stop-start, highly personal building process are both, in their own ways, systems, one driven by the needs of storytelling and entertainment, the other by a widow's evolving sense of what she wanted her house to be. The house grows not according to a plan, but according to impulse, revision, and the gradual accumulation of ideas. It is less a structure than a process, less a dwelling than an ongoing negotiation with space and time. Long before anyone calls it a mystery house, Lanata Villa has become something more unusual, a fortune converted into an ongoing architectural argument with time. By the turn of the century, around 1900, the Santa Clara Valley was transforming. The orchards that once dominated the landscape are giving way to suburban development as San Jose expands. Electric streetcars now run along Winchester Boulevard, and the Southern Pacific Railroad has added stops to serve the growing population. In this changing landscape, Lanata Villa sits as a strange hybrid, part working ranch with its remaining fruit trees and outbuildings, part urban palazzo rising improbably from the valley floor. Travel writers visiting San Jose during this period describe the mansion in tones of wonder and bewilderment. An article in Sunset magazine from 1902 calls it the most remarkable private residence in California, noting its countless turrets and towers, and a complexity of design that defies easy description. The writer, who was apparently not granted access to the interior, could only observe from the road where the Queen Anne facade presented its jumble of architectural styles, Gothic pointed arches beside classical columns, Moorish keyhole windows next to standard Victorian sash. This is also the period when the Winchester Repeating Arms Company reaches the height of its commercial success and begins to face increasing public scrutiny. The company's rifles are now ubiquitous in American life, used for hunting, sport shooting, law enforcement, and military service, but they are also increasingly associated with violence. The Spanish-American War of 1898 brought new attention to the weapons industry, as did labor conflicts in which armed company guards and strikers exchanged fire. Progressive-era journalists and reformers begin to ask uncomfortable questions about the moral implications of wealth derived from weapons manufacturing. Some later narratives claim that, during this period, Sarah consulted a Boston medium, a spiritualist, named Adam Coons, according to some versions, who told her she was cursed by the spirits of all those killed by Winchester rifles. The medium supposedly advised her that the only way to appease these spirits and forestall her own death was to move west and build a house and to never cease building as long as she lived. The spirits, she was allegedly told, would be confused by the constantly changing architecture and thus unable to find and harm her. This story, which has become central to the Winchester Mystery House legend, appears in numerous popular accounts, tourist brochures, and even in academic discussions of American folklore. But as historian Joe Nickel and biographer Mary Jo Ignafo have both documented, there is no contemporary evidence for it. No letters, diaries, newspaper accounts, or other documents from Sarah's lifetime mention such a seance. The story appears to have emerged sometime in the 1920s or 1930s after the house opened to the public, and was then repeated so frequently that it acquired the patina of established fact. What can be documented from this period are Sarah's architectural choices, which become increasingly intricate and symbolically suggestive. She commissions a conservatory with an elaborately sloped floor designed to carry away water from the indoor plants, with small trapdoors in the floor that open to drainage pipes below. She adds an indoor garden room with a glass roof composed of colored panes that cast shifting patterns of light across white marble floors. And she begins to incorporate more and more stained glass throughout the house, much of it featuring spiderweb patterns or the number 13, elements that will later be interpreted as evidence of occult interests. The spiderweb motif appears in multiple windows, each slightly different in design. The most famous of these, a large window composed of amber and blue glass with 13 jewel-like inserts, is never actually installed during Sarah's lifetime. It is found after her death stored in a secondary room, its purpose and intended location unknown. The number 13 also recurs: rooms with 13 windows, staircases with 13 steps, chandeliers with 13 lights. Later, tour guides will present these as evidence of numerological obsession or spiritual symbolism. But 13 was also a number with traditional associations in Freemasonry, an organization to which Sarah's husband William had belonged, and it appears in various forms of Victorian decorative arts without supernatural implications. The conservatory, completed around 1901, reveals both Sarah's aesthetic ambitions and her practical ingenuity. The room is designed to house tropical plants that require high humidity and consistent temperature. The sloped floor ensures that water used for misting and irrigation will drain efficiently rather than pooling and damaging the foundation. The glass roof is composed of sections that can be opened on pulleys to allow for ventilation in the California summer heat. Beneath the floor, a network of pipes carries water to cisterns in the garden where it can be reused for outdoor irrigation. The system is elegant, functional, and suggests a mind capable of solving complex engineering problems. During this period, Sarah also maintains her investments with evident skill. Letters between her and her attorneys in New Haven, preserved in the Winchester family papers at the Connecticut Historical Society, discuss stock portfolios, real estate transactions in California and Connecticut, and the management of her ongoing income from Winchester Repeating Arms dividends. She sells some properties, purchases others, and adjusts her holdings as market conditions change. A letter from her attorney, dated March 1903, compliments her sound judgment in financial matters and notes that her net worth has continued to grow despite the substantial sum spent on the house. Viewed in this Gilded Age context, Lanata Villa performs a double role. It is a display of industrial wealth, evidence that the Winchester fortune can support ongoing expenditure on a scale that few private citizens could match. But it is also a private retreat from the world that produced that wealth. The house has no grand public rooms designed for entertaining on the scale of Newport mansions or New York ballrooms. The ballroom, while elegantly appointed, is relatively modest in size. There are no receiving halls calculated to impress visiting dignitaries or business associates. The house is turned inward, a labyrinth of private spaces designed for an occupant who sought control and solitude rather than social display. Whether or not spirits are involved, the house is clearly being asked to bear more than usual domestic weight, as shield, statement, and perhaps in ways that Sarah herself might not have articulated, as a kind of atonement. Not atonement in the sense of the ghost story legend with its vision of a guilt-racked widow building to appease the angry dead, but atonement in a subtler sense, the conversion of death money into something beautiful, the transformation of a weapons fortune into a monument to craft and design, the attempt to balance, through architectural creation, the destructive power of the industry that funded it. The more America debates the costs of its prosperity, the more labor activists and progressive reformers point to the human price of industrial wealth, the more the strange, sprawling house of the rifle heiress becomes a screen for the nation's unease. Sometime before 1906, on an upper floor of Lanata Villa near the bell tower, carpenters finished a compact chamber that later guides will call the séance room. The space measures roughly 10 feet square, with dark wood paneling and a single interior window that looks out not onto the grounds but into an adjacent hallway. Contemporary floor plans preserved in the Winchester Mystery House archives show that the room has one entrance and 3 exits, including one door that opens into a shallow cupboard, forcing anyone who mistakenly chooses it to back out and try again. The room is located close to the tower, whose bell could be rung from a pull rope that runs down through the floors to Sarah's bedroom on the 2nd floor. According to accounts collected later from servants and neighbors, that bell was sometimes heard ringing at odd hours, at midnight or at 2 in the morning. The servants said Mrs. Winchester rang it to signal something, though what exactly was never made clear. Later legend will suggest the bell summoned spirits or warned them away, depending on which version of the story one hears. The architectural features of the room are real and documented. What cannot be documented from contemporary sources is how or whether Sarah used this space for spiritualist purposes. Legends recorded in the 20th century insist that she met spirits here nightly, receiving instructions about which rooms to build or alter next. Some accounts describe her sitting alone in the small chamber with pencil and paper, sketching designs that she would then give to the carpenters the following morning. Others claim that she consulted with 13 spirits, one for each of the chairs that supposedly circled the room, though no such chairs appear in photographs or inventories. What we have instead is architecture, a small, carefully controlled space in a house otherwise full of vistas, long hallways, and rooms that open unexpectedly into other rooms. The séance room, if that is indeed what it was, represents enclosure in a structure defined by sprawl. It is a node of concentration in a web of expansion. Whether or not Sarah believed she was communicating with spirits there, the room's design suggests it was meant for solitary contemplation, for decision-making away from the eyes of servants and workmen, for the kind of private consideration that any architect or builder might require when planning the next phase of a complex project. Not far from this room, stored in a corridor off the second-floor landing, stands a tall stained glass window that has never been installed. The window, roughly 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, is composed of a spiderweb pattern in amber and blue glass, with 13 colored glass jewels embedded at the intersections of the web. House historian Janan Boyume, writing in the Winchester Mystery House blog in the 2000s, notes that Sarah designed this window herself, combining two of her favorite motifs, the spider's web and the number 13. The glass was manufactured by the Pacific American Decorative Company of San Francisco, whose invoices for the window were found in the 1970s, sealed behind a panel in the adjacent dining room. The spiderweb pattern appears throughout the house in various forms, in other stained glass windows, in carved wood ornaments, in the design of some parquet floors. Victorian design manuals of the period show that spiderwebs were a fashionable motif in the aesthetic movement, symbolizing both nature's geometry and the interconnection of all things. They also carried associations with patience, craft, and the slow accretion of meaning over time, qualities that certainly resonate with the decades-long project of building La Nata Villa. But the spiderweb is also, unavoidably, a trap. It is a structure built to catch and hold, to ensnare what flies into it unaware. This double meaning makes it ideal for a house whose legend will later insist it was designed to trap ghosts. Whether Sarah intended that symbolism is unknowable. What is clear is that she returned to the image again and again, and that its geometric precision must have appealed to some mathematical or aesthetic sense that found satisfaction in symmetry and pattern. The 13 jewels in the famous window, small diamond-shaped pieces of colored glass in amber, blue, and red, are sometimes interpreted as representing the 13 colonies or the 13 steps in certain Masonic rituals, or simply Sarah's fascination with the number. 13 appears throughout the house with a frequency that seems too consistent to be accidental. Bathrooms with 13 windows, staircases with 13 steps, chandeliers with 13 bulbs or arms, rooms with 13 ceiling panels. In some cases, these 13s may be intentional design choices. In others, they may be the result of later counterseeing patterns where none was intended. But taken together, they contribute to the sense that the house is encoded, that its architecture speaks a language that we can observe but not fully translate. The glass itself is beautiful, independent of any symbolism. Afternoon light coming through the amber sections casts pools of golden radiance onto the floors and walls. The blue panes create cool islands of twilight, even at midday. The jewels catch the sun and throw small prisms of color into corners and across thresholds. Functionally, the window would have been stunning wherever it was installed, but it was never installed. It remained stored, wrapped and protected until after Sarah's death, when it was found and eventually placed in a location chosen not by her, but by the new owners of the house. Why was it never installed? There are no letters or notes explaining Sarah's decision. Perhaps she simply never found the right place for it. Perhaps she changed her mind about the design. Perhaps the room for which it was intended was never completed or was altered in ways that made the window unsuitable. Or perhaps, and this is as likely as any other explanation, the window was meant to remain potential rather than actual, an ideal of design that satisfied her more as an object in itself than as a functional element of the house. Here, the architecture shifts from merely complex to symbolically charged. The spiderweb window, whether installed or not, becomes a lens through which visitors will later interpret the entire structure. It suggests mystery, intention, hidden meaning. It invites the question, what was she trying to say? And because Sarah herself left no clear answer, the window can be made to mean almost anything. They are, in a sense, traps, not for spirits but for meaning. Every element of the house that seems deliberately strange or symbolically loaded becomes a site where interpretation can settle and multiply. The architecture, by resisting simple explanation, invites endless speculation, and speculation, over time, hardens into legend. In a house famed for staircases that go nowhere, it is a window that most clearly reveals how much outsiders want the building to explain her soul. Around 1903, visitors to San Jose who managed to glimpse Lanada Villa from Winchester Boulevard saw a property that has become a landmark of architectural eccentricity. The mansion now sprawls across what tax assessors estimate at approximately 24,000 square feet of interior space, though the exact figure is difficult to determine given the irregular additions, interior courts, and multi-level sections that make simple measurement nearly impossible. Contemporary city directories describe it as the Winchester estate, extensive grounds, private, and list no street number because the property occupies an entire block. The number of rooms is a subject of debate even during Sarah's lifetime. Later, promotional materials will claim the house contained 500 or even 700 rooms, numbers that are almost certainly exaggerations. A more reliable count, conducted after Sarah's death for insurance and sale purposes, puts the total at approximately 160 rooms, including bathrooms, storage areas, and small servants' quarters. But even this count is complicated by the question of what constitutes a room. Many of the house's spaces are oddly shaped, some are little more than large closets, and some open into each other without clear demarcation of boundaries. What can be verified from property records and photographs is the house's essential dimensions. Roughly 6 acres of buildings and immediate grounds, with gardens and orchards extending over the remaining acreage. The main structure rises 3 to 4 stories in most sections, with the bell tower, before its collapse in the 1906 earthquake, extending to 7 stories at its peak. The house contains 47 fireplaces, each with a different design in tile or carved stone, and approximately 2,000 doors and 10,000 windows, if one counts every door in cabinetry and every pane in French doors and transoms as some later tallies did. Public perception of the house during this period is shaped largely by its sheer excess in a city where most residences are modest Victorian cottages or farmhouses. Diaries from San Jose residents remark on the estate's size and the owner's reclusiveness. One entry from a San Jose normal school teacher, dated April 1904 and preserved in the California State University archives, notes, "Past the Winchester place today, more additions visible. One wonders what can require so much space. The lady is said to be quite alone there, except for servants, a puzzle." Meanwhile, the public debate over the morality of firearms fortunes intensified during the first years of the 20th century. Newspaper editorials in progressive publications, such as McClure's Magazine and The Arena, question the ethics of accumulating wealth through the manufacture of weapons. The Winchester Company itself, while still profitable, faces labor disputes and increasing competition from other arms manufacturers. Stories of frontier violence, of Winchester rifles used in the subjugation of Native American tribes, of hunting parties that decimated buffalo herds, and of robberies and murders committed with weapons bearing the Winchester name. All these narratives circulate in an America that is beginning to examine the costs of its expansion and industrialization. Sarah Winchester herself issues no public statements about her family's business or the source of her wealth. No surviving letter from her hand addresses the question of guilt or responsibility. She does not write essays or give interviews. She does not make philanthropic gestures on the scale of Andrew Carnegie's libraries or John D. Rockefeller's universities. No hospitals or schools bear her name. No foundations distribute her wealth to worthy causes. Her monument, if it can be called that, is the house itself, private, peculiar, and growing year by year without any clear end in view. The persistent rumor that she is trying to outbuild a curse reflects not only the Gothic sensibilities of the era, but also a broader cultural need to impose narrative order on visible excess. If a widow spends a fortune on an ever-expanding house, there must be a reason. and in the absence of any stated reason, the public will supply one. The curse narrative accomplishes several things simultaneously. It makes Sarah a sympathetic figure, tormented rather than merely eccentric. It provides a moral framework in which wealth and suffering are linked, the idea that money cannot buy happiness, that great fortunes carry great burdens. And it offers a kind of rough justice. The Winchester rifles brought death, and now death, in the form of vengeful spirits, pursues the Winchester heir. In this way, Lanata Villa becomes less a private residence than a public text, interpreted almost entirely by people who never set foot inside it. Newspaper articles cite sources close to the family, or servants who wished to remain anonymous, but these sources, if they existed at all, left no verifiable record. What we have instead is a cascade of interpretation, each account building on the previous one, adding details and color until the legend acquires the density and persistence of fact. The house itself, the actual structure of wood, brick, glass, and stone, resists easy interpretation. Its features can be read as evidence of supernatural obsession or as examples of practical innovation. The many bathrooms and modern plumbing can be seen as evidence of concern for hygiene and comfort, or as an attempt to provide washing facilities that would purify spaces contaminated by spiritual presence. The switchback staircase can be understood as accommodation for arthritic joints, or as a device to confuse ghosts who supposedly cannot navigate turns. The fact that the house has no master bedroom can be seen as Sarah's desire for privacy and flexibility. She apparently moved frequently between different sleeping quarters, or as evidence that she was fleeing from room to room, seeking safety from supernatural pursuers. The architecture itself does not resolve these contradictions. It simply is, complex, idiosyncratic, beautiful in some aspects, and baffling in others. Visitors in the early 1900s who were granted entry, mostly delivery people, tradesmen, and the occasional neighbor, come away with impressions of grandeur mixed with disorientation. One account describes wandering through a series of parlors, each furnished differently, each opening onto hallways that seem to lead in unexpected directions. Another mentions the profusion of stained glass, the way colored light falls across polished floors, and makes it difficult to judge distances and dimensions. The house's extravagance, its 47 staircases, its 47 fireplaces, a number that matches the staircases, suggesting Sarah appreciated symmetry and accumulation, its multiple kitchens and bathrooms, is contrasted repeatedly in the press with images of factory workers and battlefield dead. Editorial cartoons from the period, preserved in archives of progressive publications, sometimes show a great mansion built on a foundation of rifles or a wealthy woman dining in luxury while ghosts press against her windows. These images are propaganda, but they are effective propaganda, linking in the public mind the ideas of weapons, wealth, guilt, and architectural excess. Long before tourists arrive, the Winchester mansion has already been turned into a morality tale, its every cornice and corridor recruited as evidence in an argument about money and death. At 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, the San Andreas Fault ruptured along a 296-mile segment from San Juan Bautista to Cape Mendocino, releasing energy equivalent to the detonation of millions of tons of high explosives. The resulting earthquake, which measured 7.8 on the moment magnitude scale, sent seismic waves radiating across Northern California. In San Francisco, 45 miles north of San Jose, the shaking lasted between 45 and 60 seconds and was followed by fires that burned for 3 days, destroying much of the city. In San Jose and the Santa Clara Valley, the duration was somewhat shorter, but the damage was severe. Newspaper accounts from Manatuatapan, the San Jose Mercury and Herald, published in the days following the quake, described chimneys collapsing throughout the city, brick facades crumbling, and wooden structures shifting on their foundations. The Hall of Records, a substantial brick building in downtown San Jose, suffered severe damage to its upper floors. St. Joseph's Church lost its bell tower. At Santa Clara College, now Santa Clara University, several buildings were rendered unsafe and later demolished, And at Lanada Villa, the mansion that Sarah Winchester had been building for 20 years, the earthquake delivered destruction on a scale that no amount of construction could repair. The official Winchester Mystery House timeline, based on accounts compiled shortly after Sarah's death and later verified through structural analysis, notes that the 7-story tower on the house's northwest corner collapsed entirely. The structure, which had been the mansion's highest point and most visible feature, folded into itself as the supporting walls gave way. Upper floors of the main house buckled, sending furniture and decorative elements crashing through ceilings into rooms below. Decorative cornices sheared away from the roofline. Chimneys, the house had 47 of them, cracked and fell, some punching through roofs, others toppling outward onto verandas and gardens. Photographs taken in the months following the earthquake, some of which are preserved in the California Historical Society's collections and others held by the Winchester Mystery House itself, show the extent of the damage. In several images, staircases that once led to upper floors now end abruptly at empty space, the rooms they served having collapsed or been demolished as too dangerous to salvage. Doors on what were once interior walls now open onto open air, 3 stories above the ground. Pipes and structural beams are exposed where walls and ceilings once concealed them. In one particularly striking photograph, a portion of the ornate ballroom ceiling has fallen away, leaving a jagged opening through which the floor above, or what remains of it, is visible. The lower floors of the house fared better. The ballroom, which occupied a first-floor wing on the south side of the mansion, emerged with its walls largely intact. The carved teak and mahogany paneling that Sarah had imported from Asia remained in place, its intricate patterns of birds, vines, and geometric designs unmarred. The parquet floors, laid in complex herringbone and basket weave patterns, were cracked in places but structurally sound. The stained glass windows had shattered in several rooms, but in others, particularly in interior spaces where the glass was protected from the most violent swaying, they survived. Sarah Winchester herself was in the house when the earthquake struck. According to an account later recorded by one of her servants and repeated by house historians, she was asleep in a bedroom on the 2nd floor. She had several such rooms and moved between them when the shaking began. She attempted to leave the room but found the door jammed in its frame by the twisting of the building. She was trapped there for some time, perhaps an hour, until servants were able to force the door open from the outside. She emerged shaken, but physically uninjured, though her arthritis was apparently aggravated by the stress and physical jolting. House historian Janan Bouaim, writing in the Winchester Mystery House blog, states that Sarah lost heart after that, ordering the rubble cleared and the structure made weather-tight, but choosing not to reconstruct the soaring verticals that had once defined the mansion's profile. The collapsed tower was removed entirely, its foundation capped and covered. The damaged upper floors were, in most cases, demolished down to the 3rd-floor level. Where rooms had partially collapsed, walls were built to seal off the ruins, creating the oddity of doors that now opened onto brick barriers. The house, which had been climbing upward for 2 decades, was suddenly truncated. The immediate aftermath of the earthquake forced Sarah to confront the limits of construction as a defense against time and disaster. No amount of building could prevent the earth itself from reshaking the foundations. No architectural ingenuity could outwit geology. The house, which had seemed in some sense infinite, always growing, never finished, perpetually in process, was revealed to be finite after all, subject to the same forces of nature that governed ordinary structures. Her attention after 1906 shifts notably. Property records show that she purchased a home in Atherton, a town on the peninsula closer to San Francisco, and to the families of her few remaining relatives. She spent increasing amounts of time there, leaving Lanada Villa in the care of a permanent staff, but no longer personally supervising daily construction. Letters between Sarah and her San Francisco attorneys, preserved among the Winchester family papers, show a marked increase in attention to financial management and estate planning. She was 67 years old in 1906, and the earthquake seems to have impressed upon her the urgency of settling her affairs. At Lanada Villa, work continued, but on a vastly reduced scale. Minor repairs, cosmetic improvements, and maintenance occupied the remaining carpenters. Some additions were made, a bedroom here, a storage room there, but the era of towers and grand visions was over. The switchback staircase remained, its 44 shallow steps still polished by Sarah's careful tread as she moved through the house. The spiderweb windows caught the California sun as they had before. But the structure as a whole was no longer reaching skyward. It had become, instead, a monument to what it had been, a record of ambition interrupted. The earthquake, then, is both literal and metaphorical rupture. It converts many of the house's oddities, staircases to nowhere, doors opening onto empty space, from intentional design quirks into the accidental artifacts of loss. What might once have been purposeful experiments in spatial play become, after the earthquake, evidence of incompleteness and abandonment. The house, which had been strange by design, became stranger still by disaster. Photographs from the period show Sarah walking through the gardens, leaning on a cane, her figure small against the truncated silhouette of the mansion behind her. The scaffolding is gone. The sound of hammers, which had been a constant presence for 2 decades, is now intermittent at best. The house has stopped growing. And in that stopping, it begins its slow transformation from private project into public symbol, a transformation that will be completed only after Sarah's death, when the doors open to paying visitors and the house that time could not finish becomes a house that the story will complete. After 1906, the true haunting of Lanata Villa is not by spirits, but by absence, the outline of structures that will never be rebuilt. In the years following 1910, property records and legal correspondence archived at the Santa Clara County Recorder's Office and in the collections of the Connecticut Historical Society show Sarah Winchester dividing her time between Lanata Villa, her home in Atherton, and occasional trips to San Francisco for business meetings with her attorneys. The frequency of her residence at the San Jose property declines noticeably. In 1912, she is listed in the Atherton City Directory as a full-time resident. By 1915, both addresses appear in various legal documents, suggesting she maintained both homes but spent the majority of her time on the peninsula. Construction at Lanata Villa slowed markedly during this decade. Workers who had been employed steadily through the 1890s and early 1900s now remember long pauses between projects. Oral histories collected by researcher Mary Jo Ignafo in the 1990s include testimony from the children and grandchildren of men who had worked on the house. One such account, from a grandson of a carpenter named Thomas Kelly, recalls that his grandfather would sometimes go 6 or 8 months without a call from Mrs. Winchester, and then suddenly be summoned back for a few weeks of work on a specific project, installing a set of cabinets perhaps, or altering the configuration of a hallway. The most significant construction project of this period is the installation of an elevator in 1916. The elevator, a hydraulic model manufactured by the Warner Elevator Company of Cincinnati, was designed to serve 3 floors and was powered by a pump in the basement that pushed water into a cylinder beneath the car, raising it smoothly and quietly. The installation required structural modifications to accommodate the shaft, and the cost, recorded in invoices found among Sarah's estate papers, came to just over $3,000, a substantial sum but one that Sarah could easily afford given her continuing income from Winchester Company dividends. The elevator is sometimes cited as evidence that Sarah was in declining health, no longer able to navigate the many staircases of her house. This interpretation is supported by the fact that she was 67 years old in 1916, and that her rheumatoid arthritis, which had troubled her since at least the 1880s, would have been significantly worsened by then. The elevator allowed her to move between floors without pain, and its installation suggests a practical concession to physical limitation rather than any supernatural purpose. During this same period, financial records show Sarah concentrating increasingly on building an investment portfolio. Historian Mary Jo Ignafo, who reviewed Sarah's account ledgers and correspondence with brokers, describes her investment strategy as far more successful than her mansion. Sarah diversified her holdings beyond Winchester repeating arms stock, purchasing railroad bonds, real estate in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and shares in a variety of industrial companies. By 1918, according to probate documents later filed after her death, her net worth had increased substantially from what she had inherited in 1881, despite the ongoing expenditure on the house. The mansion itself, once a symbol of ceaseless change, becomes instead a slowly aging shell. The switchback staircase remains, its treads polished smooth by the careful steps of a short woman, now in her 70s, each shallow riser a concession to joints that could no longer flex as they once had. The spiderweb windows catch the California sun, as they always have, but now they look out over a city that is rapidly modernizing around them. Downtown San Jose in 1915 had electric streetlights, paved roads, and a population approaching 40,000. The orchards that once surrounded Lana de Villa are giving way to suburban development. The estate, which had seemed in the 1890s like a private kingdom apart from the world, is increasingly surrounded by neighbors, by commerce, by the 20th century pressing in from all sides. Contextually, the United States during this period is moving through profound transformation. The progressive era brings labor reforms, women's suffrage activism, and continuing debates about the concentration of wealth. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, reorders the global balance of power and brings new attention to the arms industry. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company, like other munitions manufacturers, prospers from military contracts, but also faces criticism from pacifist and socialist groups who question the ethics of profiting from war. Sarah, insulated by wealth and privacy, does not engage in these debates publicly. She issues no statements, makes no charitable gestures tied to the war, and does not, so far as any record shows, comment on the role Winchester rifles play in the conflict. What has changed is her engagement with the house. The project that had consumed her attention for 3 decades is now largely complete, or, more accurately, is as complete as it will ever be. She lives in it, moves through its rooms, adjusts small details of decoration or furniture placement. But the grand ambition, the perpetual expansion, the constant arrival of carpenters and glaziers and plasterers, all of that has subsided. The house has become what it will remain for the rest of her life, a fixed structure, eccentric and labyrinthine, but no longer growing. Photographs from this period, some taken by San Jose photographers who specialized in documenting local estates, and some commissioned by Sarah herself for insurance or legal purposes, show a mansion that is settled into its final form. The roofline, no longer rising with new towers and turrets, presents a jagged but stable silhouette. The gardens, which once had been construction sites, are now mature landscapes with established trees and flower beds. The verandas, which had been scaffolded and partially rebuilt multiple times, now appear finished, their decorative trim weathered to a soft gray. Servants who remained with Sarah into her final years, and whose recollections were recorded in the 1920s and 1930s after her death, describe her as a woman of routine. She rose late, breakfast alone, attended to correspondence in a small office off the main parlor, and walked in the gardens in the afternoon if her health permitted. She rarely received visitors. She did not attend church services, though she maintained a membership at the San Jose Presbyterian Church and made occasional donations. She read extensively, novels, newspapers, magazines on architecture and design. She played the piano, though her arthritic hands made this increasingly difficult. This is not the image of a woman in the grip of supernatural obsession. It is the image of a wealthy elderly widow, living quietly in a house that has become less a project than a setting, less an ongoing argument with time than a space in which time is simply passing. The house no longer needs to grow because Sarah herself is no longer reaching toward anything. She has built what she built, she has spent what she chose to spend, and now, in her 70s, she inhabits the result. As the nation marches into a new century, a century of automobiles and airplanes, of jazz and motion pictures, of mass communication and industrial warfare, the house that once seemed always in motion settles into a kind of suspended sentence. It will not be torn down, but neither will it be completed. It stands, odd and intricate and slightly forlorn, a monument from an earlier age of eccentric individualism, waiting for whatever comes next. As the nation marches into a new century, the house that once seemed always in motion settles into a kind of suspended sentence. On September 5th, 1922, at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, Sarah Lockwood Winchester died in her sleep at Lanata Villa. She was 83 years old. The death certificate, filed with the Santa Clara County Health Department and signed by her physician, Dr. Arthur Sexton, lists the cause of death as heart failure, with contributing factors of chronic arthritis and general physical decline. There is no indication that the death was anything other than the expected culmination of old age and long illness. News of her death appeared the following day in the San Jose Mercury Herald under a modest headline, "Mrs. Sarah L. Winchester dies at her home." The brief obituary noted her identity as widow of William Winchester, her residence in San Jose for 36 years, and the fact that she had been for decades one of the city's most prominent though reclusive residents. The article mentioned the unusual mansion, but with restraint, describing it simply as of remarkable design and considerable size. There was no mention of ghosts, curses, or supernatural obsessions. Those details would come later, when the house opened to the public and the need for spectacle overtook the requirements of respectful journalism. The probated will, which Sarah had signed in multiple sections over the preceding decade with careful attention to detail, directed that her considerable holdings pass to her niece Frances Marion Merriman Marriott, known as Marion, and to several long-serving employees and loyal associates. The will, preserved in the Santa Clara County probate records and running to more than 40 pages, including attachments and schedules, is a meticulous document. It lists stocks and bonds in multiple companies, real estate holdings in California and Connecticut, bank accounts, and personal property ranging from jewelry to furniture to artwork. The total value of the probated estate was calculated at approximately $525,000 in 1922 dollars, a figure that surprises many later observers given Sarah's reputed wealth, until it is understood that most of her fortune had already been distributed to heirs and charities through trusts and gifts made during her lifetime or had been spent on the house itself. The San Jose mansion is notably absent from the list of cherished bequests detailed in the will. It passes to Marion Marriott along with the rest of the California real estate, but there is no special instruction attached to it, no request that it be preserved or maintained, no expression of sentiment or attachment. In the eyes of the law and of Sarah's estate planners, Lanata Villa is simply property, valuable for its land but troublesome as a building. Appraisers brought in by the estate deemed the structure of little monetary value. The house's custom carpentry and idiosyncratic floor plan, which had been expensive to create, were now liabilities. The building could not easily be converted to another use. It was too large for a single-family residence by any normal standard, too disorganized to serve as a hotel or sanitarium, and too far from downtown San Jose to be viable as commercial space. One appraisal report, quoted in later histories of the property, described the mansion as almost impossible to market in its current configuration and suggested that the land value would actually be higher if the structure were demolished. Marion Marriott, who had her own household in Connecticut and no desire to relocate to California, made plans to liquidate the estate. Within months of Sarah's death, the contents of the house were sold off in a series of auctions that attracted dealers, collectors, and curiosity seekers from San Francisco and beyond. Newspaper advertisements for the sales, placed in the Mercury Herald and the San Francisco Chronicle, promised fine European furnishings, artworks, decorative objects, and household goods from the Winchester estate. The auctions took place over several weekends in late 1922 and early 1923. Contemporary newspaper reports describe lines of buyers arriving at the property, wandering through the mansion's rooms with catalog numbers in hand, marking items they wished to bid on. Much of the furniture, carved mahogany pieces, upholstered settees, imported tables and cabinets, went to private buyers. Paintings and decorative objects were snapped up by dealers who would resell them in San Francisco galleries. The Tiffany lamps, of which Sarah had owned several, brought high prices. So did the more elaborate pieces of stained glass that could be removed without damaging the windows themselves. What remained after the auctions was a structure largely stripped of its movable beauty. The architectural features, the carved wood paneling, the parquet floors, the built-in cabinets, the stained glass windows that were part of the structure, stayed in place because they could not be easily removed. But the mansion now echoed in a way it never had when Sarah was alive. The rooms that had been filled with Persian rugs and European furniture and art collected over decades were now empty shells. The grand ballroom, which had once been appointed for entertaining even if no entertainment ever took place, was now simply a large room with beautiful walls and nothing in it. In 1923, the property was sold to a group of investors for a price that sources variously report as between $5,000 and $15,000, a fraction of what it had cost to build. The new owners leased the mansion to John and Mamie Brown, a couple who had previously operated tourist attractions in the Sierra Nevada. The Browns saw in the house's oddities an opportunity. They understood that the building's eccentricities, which had been a liability to the estate, could be an asset if properly marketed. 9 months after Sarah Winchester's death, in the summer of 1923, Lanata Villa opened to the public as a tourist attraction, with the Browns serving as managers and guides. The early admission price was 50 cents. Visitors were led through a selection of the house's most unusual features. The staircase to nowhere, the doors opening into walls, the switchback staircase with its 44 shallow steps, the spiderweb window now finally installed in a prominent location where tourists could admire it. The Browns provided narration that blended architectural fact with the growing body of legend about Sarah's motives and beliefs. It was, from the beginning, a mixture of history and showmanship, enough truth to be plausible, enough embellishment to be entertaining. In the ledgers of the auctioneer and the receipts of early tour operators, Lanata Villa completes its transformation from private architectural experiment to public commodity. The house that had been built to serve one woman's vision, that had been funded by rifle dividends and shaped by grief, autonomy, and whim, now exists to generate ticket revenue. Its oddities, which once reflected the freedom to build without justification, now require justification in the form of ghost stories and curses. Its beauty, which once needed no audience, is now on display for anyone who can pay the admission fee. Sarah Winchester had built a house that would outlive her. On that count, she succeeded. But the house that survives is not entirely the house she built. It is also the house that the story has made, a haunted mansion, a mystery, a monument not to architectural freedom, but to the legend of a widow driven by guilt and fear. The transformation, which began in newspaper columns during her lifetime, is now complete. The private becomes public, the particular becomes mythic, and the woman who built in silence is forever explained by voices not her own. The house that money built and grief shaped now survives by selling tickets to its own disarray. By the summer of 1924, lines of curious visitors formed regularly at the gates on South Winchester Boulevard, guided by hand-painted signs that now identify the property as the Winchester Mystery House. The phrase itself, Mystery House, appears for the first time in advertising materials from this period, printed on small flyers distributed in San Francisco hotels and train stations. Whether the Browns coined it themselves or adopted it from local usage is unclear from surviving records, but the name catches on immediately, more memorable than the Winchester Mansion or Lanata Villa, and far more suggestive of the experience the Browns are promising: secrets, strangeness, and supernatural mystery. Some accounts, repeated in numerous later sources but difficult to verify with contemporary documentation, credit Harry Houdini with suggesting the name. Houdini, the famous magician and escape artist who had by the 1920s turned much of his attention to debunking fraudulent spiritualists, did visit California in 1924 as part of a West Coast tour. And he may well have visited the Winchester Mansion. He had a documented interest in unusual buildings and in claims of supernatural phenomena. One version of the story holds that Houdini took a midnight tour of the house, became fascinated by its staircases and dead-end hallways, and remarked to John Brown that it was a mystery house if ever there was one. Whether or not Houdini uttered those specific words, the story has the quality of founding myth. It attributes the naming of the house to a famous figure. It adds glamour by association, and it ties the property to the broader culture of 1920s spiritualism and skepticism that Houdini himself embodied. True or not, the story serves the Browns' purposes by lending authority to the idea that the house is genuinely mysterious rather than merely odd. The Browns quickly adopt the full vocabulary of hauntings and curses in their marketing and in the tours themselves. Early brochures, examples of which are preserved in the California Historical Society collections, promise visitors a chance to see the mansion built by Spirit's command and to walk through the strangest house in the world. The narrative that emerges in these early tourist years elaborates significantly on the newspaper stories from the 1890s. Now, Sarah is not merely building to forestall death, she is building under direct orders from ghosts, specifically the ghosts of those killed by Winchester rifles. The Boston medium, unnamed in earlier versions, is sometimes given a name and a detailed backstory. Nightly seances in the small chamber near the bell tower become established elements of the tour script. At the same time, letters to the editors of San Jose newspapers begin to appear, written by neighbors and former employees protesting what they see as the defamation of Sarah Winchester's memory. One such letter, published in the Mercury Herald in October 1924, is from a woman who identifies herself as having worked as a housekeeper at Lanada Villa in the 1910s. She writes, "Mrs. Winchester was a kind and intelligent employer who paid fair wages and maintained high standards. I never witnessed anything resembling a séance, nor did she speak of spirits. These stories do her a great disservice." Another letter from a San Jose businessman describes Sarah as a shrewd and capable woman who managed her financial affairs with acumen, and expresses dismay that she is now being portrayed as a madwoman ruled by superstition. These protests, sincere as they are, have little effect against the momentum of the ghost story. The legend is simply more interesting than the reality, more suited to the needs of a tourist attraction, and more in keeping with the cultural appetite for tales of haunted houses and eccentric heiresses. The Browns are not malicious in their storytelling. They are entrepreneurs responding to market demand. Visitors want mystery, and mystery is what they are given. The California Historical Landmarks Program, established in 1931, designates the Winchester House as California Historical Landmark 868 in 1974, recognizing it as an architectural curiosity and a monument to one woman's tribute to the firearm. The language is carefully neutral, neither endorsing nor denying the supernatural legends. Later, in 1974, the house was added to the National Register of Historic Places, the federal list of properties deemed worthy of preservation due to historical, architectural, or cultural significance. The National Register application describes the mansion's Queen Anne architecture, its unusual construction history, and its importance as an example of late 19th century domestic design, but it also acknowledges the popular legends that have become inseparable from the property's identity. Architecturally, the house remains largely as Sarah left it after the 1906 earthquake, truncated, asymmetrical, riddled with small, peculiar spaces. Some restoration work is done by the Browns and later owners, roofs repaired, paint refreshed, broken windows replaced, but the essential structure is unchanged. The switchback staircase still climbs its 9 feet over 44 shallow steps. The doors to nowhere still open onto walls or empty space. The spiderweb window, now installed in a second-floor hall where visitors can admire it, still catches the afternoon light in pools of amber and blue. What changes is the narrative wrapped around those spaces. The staircase is no longer a concession to arthritis. It is a device to confuse ghosts. The doors are no longer the result of successive building phases overtaking earlier designs. They are intentional traps. The window is no longer simply beautiful. It is a coded message, a numerological spell, a symbol of Sarah's obsession. Every architectural feature is recruited into the story of a haunted house, and the story, once established, becomes self-reinforcing. Visitors come expecting ghosts, and so they interpret everything they see through that lens. By the end of the 1920s, the Winchester Mystery House had become a fixture of California tourism. It is featured in travel guides, mentioned in articles about unusual American destinations, and recommended by hotel concierges in San Francisco as a worthwhile day trip. The admission price rises from 50 cents to 75 cents to $1 as demand increases. The Browns expand the tour routes, opening additional rooms and adding more narrative embellishments. They install electric lighting to replace the gas fixtures Sarah had used, making it possible to conduct tours in the evening and heightening the atmosphere of eeriness. In architectural terms, the house is a hybrid. It is a genuine example of late Victorian design, with legitimate historical and aesthetic interest. But it is also a stage set, a backdrop for storytelling, a three-dimensional illustration of a legend. The two aspects are inseparable now. To visit the Winchester House is to experience both the building Sarah created and the myth that has accreted around it. The architecture and the story have become a single entity, neither complete without the other. The house no longer grows in wood and plaster, it grows in story. Each retelling adds new details, clarifies ambiguities, smooths over contradictions. The narrative becomes richer and more elaborate, while the building itself remains fixed, preserved, maintained, but no longer changing. In this sense, the Winchester Mystery House is perpetually unfinished, not because Sarah is still building it, but because the story is still being built around it, one tour group at a time, one guidebook at a time, one legend at a time. The structure no longer grows in wood and plaster, it grows in story. In the 1970s and 1980s, under General Manager Keith Kittle, the Winchester Mystery House underwent significant physical renovation even as its supernatural reputation continued to grow. Kittle, who managed the property from 1973 to 2014, oversaw a period of major restoration work designed to stabilize the structure and make it safe for the increasing numbers of visitors. Roofs that had leaked for decades were replaced or repaired with careful attention to matching the original materials and profiles. The Lincrusta wall coverings, which had begun to peel and crack in many rooms, were stabilized using adhesives developed for historical preservation. Floors were reinforced where foot traffic had worn them dangerously thin. Windows were reglazed, chimneys repointed, foundations underpinned. At the same time, the Winchester Mystery House was expanding as a commercial attraction. A new visitors center was constructed on the grounds, complete with a gift shop, ticket office, and rest facilities. A museum dedicated to Winchester firearms was added to the complex, displaying rifles from throughout the company's history and providing historical context for the source of Sarah's wealth. Highway billboards along California's major routes began to feature dramatic images. A silhouetted mansion against a moonlit sky, sometimes with a ghostly figure in one of the windows. The marketing materials promised mystery, ghosts, and the strangest house in America. The strategy worked. Attendance figures from this period, compiled by the Winchester Mystery House Business Office and later cited in newspaper articles and tourism studies, show steady growth. In the early 1970s, the house attracted approximately 50,000 visitors per year. By the mid-1980s, that number had more than doubled. By the 1990s, annual attendance exceeded 200,000. The property had become one of California's most visited private attractions, a must-see for tourists interested in the supernatural or in architectural oddities. But even as the commercial side of the operation flourished, a different conversation was taking place among historians and preservationists. In the late 1980s, Mary Jo Ignafo, a historian at San Jose State University, began researching Sarah Winchester's life with the intention of separating fact from legend. Ignafo's work, which eventually resulted in a biography published in 2007, involved extensive archival research. She reviewed property records, financial documents, personal correspondence, and contemporary newspaper accounts, and she conducted interviews with descendants of people who had known Sarah or worked on the house. Ignafo's findings challenged many of the standard elements of the Winchester legend. She found no evidence that Sarah had ever consulted a Boston medium or any other spiritualist. She found letters and account books that portrayed Sarah as a sharp-minded businesswoman, capable of managing complex investments and real estate transactions. She found testimony from neighbors and employees describing Sarah as reserved and eccentric, certainly, but rational and competent. And she found that many of the house's supposedly mysterious features had prosaic explanations. The shallow stairs designed for arthritic joints, the doors to nowhere created by successive additions and earthquake damage, the interior windows that had once been exterior before new wings were added. Ignafo's research, along with similar work by skeptical investigators like Joe Nickel, was published in academic journals and popular magazines, but it had relatively little impact on the house's public image. The ghost story was too well established, too central to the property's identity and commercial success to be dislodged by scholarship. Moreover, many visitors seemed untroubled by the contradiction between historical fact and entertaining fiction. They came for the experience, the winding hallways, the strange architecture, the frisson of being in a supposedly haunted place. And whether or not the ghost stories were true was, for them, beside the point. Within the house's operations, however, Ignafo's work created some tension. Tour guides were sometimes caught between competing demands, the commercial imperative to tell an engaging story that emphasized mystery and the supernatural, and an emerging ethical concern about perpetuating demonstrable falsehoods about a real person. Internal training documents from this period, referenced in later articles and interviews, reveal that guides were instructed to present the ghost stories as legends and local tradition rather than as verified fact. But in practice, the distinction was often blurred. Guides who wanted to maximize tips or who simply enjoyed the theatrical aspects of the job would emphasize the spooky elements and downplay the skeptical qualifications. One anonymous guide, quoted in a 1998 article in the San Jose Metro, expressed frustration. "We're supposed to count 13 everywhere, 13 windows in a room, 13 panels in a ceiling. Sometimes the count is forced. You skip a window or count a transom twice to get to 13. But that's what management wants, because that's what visitors expect. I feel like I'm lying, but if I don't do it, I get complaints." The 13s had become a central element of the tour script. Visitors were told that Sarah was obsessed with the number 13, that it appeared everywhere in the house, and that this obsession was tied to her belief in spiritualism and numerology. Guides pointed out rooms with 13 windows, though in some cases the count required creative interpretation of what constituted a window. They noted staircases with 13 steps, chandeliers with 13 lights, and so on. In truth, 13 does appear with some frequency in the house, but so do other numbers. It is unclear whether Sarah intended any symbolic significance or whether the pattern is a combination of architectural coincidence and confirmation bias. Meanwhile, architectural historians and preservationists began to pay closer attention to the house's genuine significance as an example of late Victorian design and as a monument to women's economic autonomy in the Gilded Age. Articles in architectural journals described the house's innovative features, the early use of indoor plumbing on such a scale, the sophisticated drainage system in the conservatory, the craftsmanship of the woodwork and stained glass. Scholars noted that Sarah, in an era when women had limited property rights and were often excluded from architectural and design professions, had effectively served as her own architect for nearly 40 years, creating a structure that, whatever its oddities, demonstrated both aesthetic ambition and technical competence. The house thus entered a new phase of its existence in which the central question was no longer, is it haunted, but rather, how do we preserve both the building and its history while also generating the revenue needed to maintain it? The Winchester Mystery House operates as a private, for-profit business, not as a publicly funded museum. It receives no government subsidies. Its preservation work, ongoing maintenance, and staff salaries are all funded by admission fees and gift shop sales. This creates a structural dependence on the very legends that historians were now calling into question. The ethical dilemma is real and not easily resolved. If the house stopped marketing itself as mysterious and haunted, would visitors still come in sufficient numbers to pay for its upkeep? Would a tour that focused solely on architectural history and late Victorian design draw 200,000 paying guests per year? The answer is uncertain, and the financial risks of finding out are considerable. And so the Winchester Mystery House continues to operate in a kind of productive tension, acknowledging scholarship in its more detailed literature, while continuing to emphasize mystery and ghosts in its primary marketing. In a place once obsessed with physical safety, a house built, according to legend, to protect against supernatural harm, the pressing issue becomes the safety of the historical record, the question of how to honor the truth about Sarah Winchester while preserving the structure she built. In a place once obsessed with physical safety, the pressing issue becomes the safety of the historical record. In the present day, visitors stand in a dim interior gallery of the Winchester Mystery House and look up at the spiderweb stained glass window that Sarah designed but never installed during her lifetime. Light filters through its amber and blue panes, the 13 glass jewels glowing like small lanterns against the leaded web pattern that holds them. The window, mounted now in a second-floor hallway where tourists pass in controlled groups, catches the California sun at certain hours and throws pools of colored light onto the polished floor. It is beautiful, that much is undeniable. Whether it is also meaningful, whether its patterns encode some message about guilt or geometry or grief, remains a matter of interpretation. Tour guides standing nearby explain, sometimes cautiously, sometimes with theatrical flourish, the legends attached to the window. Some guides note that 13 is significant in numerology and spiritualism and suggest that Sarah chose it for occult reasons. Others mention Freemasonry and its ritual use of 13th, connecting the window to Sarah's husband's membership in that fraternal organization. Still others simply describe it as decorative, part of the aesthetic movement's fascination with natural patterns and geometric designs. All three interpretations are offered, sometimes in the same tour, leaving visitors to choose which explanation they find most convincing or most appealing. Nearby, the switchback staircase still rises its 9 or 10 feet and 44 gentle steps, each tread now framed by handrails, worn smooth not by Sarah's careful grip, but by the hands of hundreds of thousands of tourists who have walked the same path. The stairs, which once served a functional purpose, allowing a small woman with painful joints to move between floors without undue stress, have become a symbol. They are photographed constantly. They appear on postcards, in travel blogs, in social media posts tagged with Winchester Mystery House. They are no longer simply stairs. They are an icon of purposeful strangeness, evidence of a mind that built in ways that defy ordinary logic. Outside, the Queen Anne facade remains a confection of gables and turrets against the California sky, its layered shingles and ornate trim still speaking the architectural language of the 1890s. But the orchard lands that once surrounded the mansion have long since been converted to other uses. The 45 acres that Sarah purchased in 1886 have been parceled and sold. Shopping centers and office parks now occupy land that once grew apricots and plums. Winchester Boulevard, once a country road, is now a major arterial route through San Jose, carrying commuter traffic between Silicon Valley campuses. The house, which once stood on the edge of civilization, is now thoroughly embedded in urban sprawl. The Winchester Mystery House today operates as both historic landmark and commercial. Attraction and the tension between those two roles remains unresolved. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, acknowledged by preservationists as an important example of late Victorian architecture and as a monument to a woman who exercised extraordinary autonomy in an era that granted women little. But it is also marketed as a haunted house, complete with flashlight tours, ghost hunting events, and Halloween spectaculars. The website invites visitors to explore the house that spirits built and to discover the mystery. Educational materials provided by the house present both the historical facts of Sarah's life and the legends about spirits and seances, usually without clearly distinguishing between the two. In recent years, the house's managers have made some efforts toward historical accuracy. Newer exhibits include information about Sarah's business acumen, her role as an employer in San Jose, and the architectural innovations she implemented. The Winchester Firearms Museum on the grounds provides context about the company's history and the technology of rifle manufacturing. though it generally avoids direct discussion of the violence those rifles were used to commit. Tour scripts have been revised to include more qualifying language according to legend, some believe, tradition holds, when presenting the supernatural elements of Sarah's story. But the core narrative remains largely unchanged because it is that narrative that draws visitors. People come to the Winchester Mystery House not primarily to learn about Queen Anne architecture or to consider the moral complexities of firearms manufacturing in the Gilded Age. They come because they have heard the stories: the widow driven by guilt, the ghosts demanding atonement, the house built as a fortress against the supernatural. They come for mystery, and the house, both the physical structure and the institution that manages it, continues to provide mystery, because mystery pays the bills. In this sense, the Winchester Mansion has succeeded in one of the goals sometimes attributed to Sarah herself. It has outlasted time. The house survives not as she built it, the earthquake and subsequent modifications saw to that, but as something she could not have anticipated, a museum of itself, a monument to the stories people tell about ambition, wealth, grief, and the desire to build something that will endure. It protects no one from ghosts, if ghosts there ever were. But it does protect, imperfectly, the memory of a woman who used her considerable freedom and resources to create something genuinely unusual. Sarah Lockwood Winchester built a house that defies easy categorization. It is too large and strange to be simply a home, too personal and eccentric to be a palace, too beautiful to be dismissed as madness, and too odd to be celebrated without qualification. It is a puzzle, but perhaps not the puzzle that legend suggests. The real mystery is not why she built. People build for all sorts of reasons, but what it means that we, more than a century later, are still trying to explain her. The house stands now as a question rather than an answer. It asks us what we think about wealth and how it should be used. It asks us what we make of a woman who chose autonomy and solitude over conventional social life. It asks us whether we believe that architecture can bear the weight of atonement, whether buildings can speak for their creators, and whether a structure filled with doors and staircases can ever truly protect against time and loss. These questions have no definitive answers, which is perhaps fitting for a house whose fame rests on being mysterious. The same spiderweb window that once caught the afternoon light for Sarah Winchester, though never installed during her lifetime, now catches it for strangers, filtered through the lens of legend and commerce. The window remains beautiful, the architecture remains intricate, and the story remains compelling. What has changed is only this: the house is no longer private. It belongs now to everyone who buys a ticket, everyone who walks its halls and tries to imagine what drove its creation. It has become, in the most complete sense, public. A space where history and myth interweave like the strands of a spider's web, each supporting the other, each impossible to remove without damaging the whole. In the end, the Winchester Mansion did not trap ghosts, nor could it shield its creator from loss. What it did, and still does, is hold a mirror to the human desire to build structures that will outlast our fears, and to the equally human habit of turning those structures into stories once we are gone. Whether those stories honor or distort the truth is a question each visitor must answer for themselves. The house offers no final judgment. It simply stands, strange and enduring, a monument built by one woman and interpreted by thousands, reminding us that every house constructed against time eventually survives only as pattern, glass, and the stories we choose to tell about it. The same spiderweb window that once caught the afternoon light for Sarah Winchester now catches it for strangers, reminding us that every house built against time eventually survives only as pattern, glass, and the stories we choose to tell about it.